I saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to me. He really thinks he'll rule over us? It's just a dream, Joseph.
Picture a desert. Not the kind you see in travel photographs. Wide, golden, and peaceful in the afternoon light. This desert is raw. It is the kind of place that does not apologize for what it is. The sun here does not warm you. It presses down on you. The air does not move. The sand at the bottom of a dry pit smells like something ancient and forgotten, like a place where things are put away and never retrieved. And in that pit, in the bone-dry earth somewhere between the fields of Dothan and the caravan road that wound south toward Egypt, a 17-year-old boy was screaming. He was screaming the names of his brothers. He was screaming for his father. He was screaming because he had walked out that morning as the most beloved son in his household, wearing the robe his father had made for him. And now that robe was gone. His sandals were gone, and the only people in the world who could help him were sitting 20 yards away eating their lunch. They could hear him. The ancient text does not hide this. It states it plainly, and it is one of the most disturbing details in the entire Hebrew Bible. Genesis 42, 21 records that years later, when the weight of what they had done finally cracked through the surface of their guilt, his brothers confessed it themselves. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. They heard every word, and they sat down to eat their bread. One theologian once observed that a physicist could calculate the exact fraction of a second it takes for a human cry to travel 25 yards to the nearest eardrum. It took those men 22 years for that same cry to travel from their ears to their hearts. This is the story of Joseph. And before you assume you already know it, before you think this is something you learned in Sunday school and have safely filed away, I want you to understand something. What happened to this young man, what was done to him, and what he became in spite of it, is one of the most extraordinary human stories in all of recorded history. Not simply in religious history. In all of human history. Historians have traced this story through the bones of ancient Egypt, through papyrus records of Middle Kingdom grain administration, through the carved inscriptions on tomb walls that have sat undisturbed in the desert sand for nearly 4,000 years. This is not folklore dressed in historical language. The evidence sits in the ground. Scholars working in Egyptology have identified canal systems in the Fayum region of Egypt that Arabic historical sources would later name the Bar Yusuf, the Canal of Joseph. They have studied vizier records from the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhet III, spanning the late 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, and found administrative titles and patterns that align with striking precision to what the book of Genesis describes. The Armstrong Institute of Biblical Archaeology has documented the way in which the ceremony Pharaoh performed when he elevated Joseph, placing a signet ring on his hand, draping him in fine linen, hanging a gold chain around his neck, is depicted in exact detail on tomb reliefs from the same era, including the tomb of Seti I, where servants of Pharaoh are shown conferring that precise golden chain on a newly promoted vizier. This is not mythology. The evidence sits in the stone, but we are getting far ahead of ourselves. Because before any of that, before the palace, before the gold chain, before the most powerful man in the ancient world placed his own signet ring onto the hand of a foreign slave and declared that only in the throne would he be greater than him, before any of that was even conceivable, there was a boy in a pit. There was a boy in a pit who had done nothing wrong except love his father and speak honestly about his dreams. And the pit is where this story begins. But before we get to the palace, we have to go back to that pit. And the pit is worse than anything you have been told. There are 3 questions that are going to drive every minute of this story. The first one is this. Why did his own brothers want him dead? Not merely disliked, not merely envied. These were grown men who looked at their 17-year-old brother walking across a field toward them and said to one another, "Come, let us kill him." What kind of hatred builds to that point inside a family? What years of accumulated wound and resentment and injustice lead 10 men to plot the murder of their own blood? That is the first question. And the answer is more complicated and more human than most people realize. The second question is this: who was the woman who destroyed everything Joseph had built in Egypt? And did she get away with it? There is a woman in this story whose name the ancient text never gives us. She is identified only by her position as the wife of Potiphar. And yet her actions set off a chain of events that nearly ended Joseph's story permanently and buried it in the darkest prison in Egypt. She saw Joseph. She wanted Joseph. He refused her day after day, and what she did next would cost him years of his life. The question is whether she ever faced any consequence for it at all. We will get to that. The answer is not what you would expect. The third question is the one that will stay with you long after this video ends. If Joseph had every reason in the world to take revenge on his brothers, and he had more power to do it than almost any man alive, why didn't he? When they finally stood before him, terrified, after everything they had put him through, he had the ability to destroy them completely. He chose not to. Understanding why he made that choice and what it cost him to make it is the heart of this entire story. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Whether you are in Nigeria, or Nashville, in London, or Lagos, in the Philippines, or in Phoenix, drop your city or country below. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed to Fireside Bible Study, please do that right now. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to Joseph, you first have to understand the household he was born into. And that household was not peaceful. It was not a stable and loving family unit with minor tensions. It was a household of competing loyalties, unresolved grief, and a patriarch whose capacity for love had always been concentrated in one direction. Jacob was Joseph's father. Jacob was a man whose entire emotional life had been oriented around one woman, a woman named Rachel. He had fallen in love with Rachel the first day he met her, at a well in a foreign land where he had fled after deceiving his own father and stealing his brother's blessing. He agreed to work 7 years for her hand in marriage, and those 7 years, the text tells us, felt like only a few days because of his love for her. But on the wedding night, Rachel's father substituted her older sister Leah under the veil, and Jacob didn't realize what had happened until morning. He had been deceived in the same way he had once deceived, and he agreed to work another 7 years for Rachel. By the end of those years, Jacob had 2 official wives, Leah and Rachel, and 2 additional women, Bilhah and Zilpah, who were the servants of those wives and who also bore him children. From these 4 women came 12 sons and a daughter. Jacob had fathered an entire tribe, but the emotional reality of that household was shaped by one undeniable fact. Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved anyone else. He always had. And that love, misdirected into favoritism toward Rachel's children, was the original wound from which everything else in this story bled. Leah was the wife Jacob had not chosen. She bore him 6 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and a daughter Dinah. Bilhah, Rachel's servant, bore Dan and Naphtali. Zilpah, Leah's servant, bore Gad and Asher. And then, finally, after years of barrenness that the text treats as a specific grief, Rachel conceived and bore Joseph. He was the 11th son. He was the firstborn of the woman Jacob had always loved most, and from the moment Joseph was born, the balance of the household shifted. Jacob's love for Joseph was not quiet or private. It was visible to everyone in that camp. It expressed itself in gifts, in time spent together, in the long conversations between an aging father and his beloved son while the other brothers worked the flocks. And then came the coat. The Hebrew word used in Genesis 37:3 is kithoneth passim, and scholars have debated its exact meaning for centuries. The King James Bible rendered it a coat of many colors, and that image has lived in the popular imagination ever since. But more careful scholarship suggests something different. The Hebrew pasim likely refers to length, to a tunic that reached to the wrists and ankles with full-length sleeves. In the ancient Near East, a garment of that kind was not workwear. It was the clothing of someone who did not do manual labor. It was the clothing of royalty, of managers, of those who supervised rather than toiled. When Jacob gave Joseph that tunic, he was not simply giving him a beautiful garment. He was making a public declaration about how he saw Joseph's future in the household. He was telling his other 10 sons, without words, that this boy was above them. The 10 brothers saw it. They could not miss it. Genesis 37:4 records. The result in plain language: when his brothers saw that their father loved Joseph more than any of them, they hated him. The Hebrew word is sane, a word that means not just jealousy or resentment, but active, burning hatred. And then Genesis records something remarkable. It says they could not speak a kind word to him. Not that they would not. They could not. Whatever civil speech might have remained between Joseph and his brothers had been consumed entirely. And into that atmosphere of existing hatred, Joseph brought his dreams. The first dream: the brothers' sheaves of grain bowed down to his sheaf. The second dream: the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Joseph told both dreams, first to his brothers, then to his father. The brothers hated him even more. Even Jacob was unsettled by the second dream. He rebuked Joseph. But then, the text adds something quiet and devastating. It says that Jacob kept the matter in mind. He was unsettled by it, but he did not stop thinking about it. There is a psychological reality to this family that modern readers often rush past. Jacob was not a wicked man. He was a man who had been through extraordinary things: exile, deception, the death of Rachel in childbirth on the road back to Canaan, 20 years of conflict with a father-in-law who had cheated him repeatedly. He was an old man by the time Joseph was a teenager, and his love for Joseph was entangled with his grief for Rachel and his fear of loss. He knew he was showing favoritism. On some level, every parent who does this knows. He could not stop himself, and the sons who watched it: Reuben, the eldest, who should have had that position; Judah, who was strong and ambitious; Simeon, who was known for his temper. All of them had been watching their father's love flow past them toward this boy for years. By the time Joseph walked out to meet them in the fields of Dothan at his father's request, the situation was already afire, waiting for a spark. Jacob sent Joseph alone. That single decision is worth pausing on, because it reveals something important about how Jacob understood, or failed to understand, the danger his favoritism had created. He sent his most beloved, most hated son, in the ornamental tunic that was itself a symbol of division, on a solo journey to find 10 brothers who could not speak a kind word to him. The brothers had moved the flocks from Shechem further north to Dothan. Joseph walked that entire distance alone. The ancient site of Dothan is identified with modern Tel Dothan, an archaeological mound on the plain west of what is now the Palestinian city of Jenin. Joseph would have been walking through open hill country, exposed, visible from a distance, the tunic catching the sun. Genesis 37:18 is the verse that most people read quickly and move past. But stop there for a moment. The text says the brothers saw Joseph from a distance, and before he even arrived, before he had said a single word, they conspired against him. The word in Hebrew is the same root used for the kind of plotting that happens in back rooms and whispered conversations. They conspired to kill him. They called him the dreamer, Habal HaChalomot, and the contempt was audible even in translation. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal devoured him. We will see what becomes of his dreams. It was Reuben, the eldest, who intervened. Do not take his life, Reuben said. Just throw him into the pit. Genesis 37:22 tells us privately that Reuben intended to come back later and rescue Joseph. He wanted to return him to his father. It was the only morally clear moment Reuben would have in this entire episode, and he would not follow through on it. They stripped him. They took the tunic, the kethoneth passium, the symbol of Jacob's love, the declaration of Joseph's favored status, and they ripped it from his body. And then they threw him into the cistern. The cistern was dry. There was no water in it. And then, here is the detail that has haunted readers of this text for 3,000 years. They sat down to eat. Joseph was in the pit below them. He was calling out to them. We know this from Genesis 42:21, where the brothers would later confess, "We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear." The pit was close enough that they could hear his voice. They ate their bread. One commentator put it this way: it took those men 22 years for the sound of Joseph's voice to travel from their ears to their hearts. While they ate, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelite traders coming from Gilead, their camels loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to Egypt. And it was Judah, the same Judah who would become the central moral figure of this story's second half, who made the proposal. What profit is there in killing our brother and concealing his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. His brothers agreed. 20 pieces of silver. That was the price of a slave in the ancient Near East during the Middle Bronze Age. Scholars have noted that this precisely matches the going rate for a young male slave documented in records from the same period. Joseph was lifted out of the pit and handed over. He was merchandise now, a line item on a trader's manifest. The caravan turned south toward Egypt. Reuben was not there. They dipped Joseph's tunic in the blood. They brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you recognize it?" And Jacob recognized it. And Jacob tore his own garments. He put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son for days. His children gathered around him and tried to comfort him, and he refused their comfort. "I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son," he said. He would not be consoled. The man who had loved Rachel so completely, whose love for her had survived her death and lived on in Joseph, now believed that what he loved most was gone. He would carry that grief for 22 years. And Joseph was moving south with the caravan. He had walked out of his father's tent that morning as the most loved boy in Canaan. He was ending the day as a piece of property, moving toward a country whose language he did not speak, whose gods he did not worship, whose customs he had never encountered. He was walking in chains toward Egypt. And when some people walk into that kind of darkness, they are consumed by it. They are broken by it. They become their wounds. What was different about Joseph, what makes his story worth 3,000 years of human attention, is that he was not going to become his wound. But that truth would take 13 years to become visible, and the road to it passed through depths far worse than the pit at Dothan. Egypt was not a simple destination. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, likely brought through the eastern gateway of the Nile Delta along what traders called the Way of the Sea, he stepped into one of the most sophisticated civilizations on earth. The Great Pyramid at Giza was already old by this point. The Sphinx had been carved. The administrative machinery of the Egyptian state was centuries deep in procedure, law, and hierarchy. Egypt ran on a system of detailed record-keeping, official titles, and ranked authority that reached from the pharaoh at the apex of every hierarchy all the way down to the lowest laborer in the quarry. Joseph entered this world as a slave. He was purchased by a man named Potiphar. The name Potiphar comes from the Egyptian Pad-u-pa-re, meaning he whom the sun god Re has given. He was Pharaoh's captain of the guard, and a senior military and security official who had direct access to Pharaoh and oversaw the protection of the palace and the incarceration of the king's prisoners. Potiphar was a man of wealth and power, and his household reflected that. Archaeologists who have studied elite Egyptian houses of the Middle Kingdom period describe structures of considerable scale. Multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, lush walled gardens with pools and shade trees, painted walls, staff quarters, storage areas, all functioning as small, self-contained economies. Joseph was assigned to work in this household as a laborer. And then something started to happen. Genesis 39:2 records it simply, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man." Potiphar noticed, not because someone told him, because he could see it. Everything Joseph's hand touched prospered. The household ran better. The accounts were more orderly. The estate produced more. Potiphar promoted Joseph, then promoted him again. Eventually, Potiphar handed Joseph the keys to everything he owned. He did not concern himself with anything in the household except the food he ate. Joseph was running it all. There is something worth sitting with in what was happening in Joseph at this point. He was a slave in a foreign country. He had been betrayed by his own family. He had every reason to do as little as possible, to survive without investing, to go through the motions of servitude while his interior life smoldered with grief and resentment. He did the opposite. He worked as if the outcome mattered. He brought his full attention and full capacity to every task he was given. Whatever it was that drove him, faith, discipline, character, the refusal to be defined by what had been done to him, it produced visible results. And it brought him to a position of considerable trust and comfort in one of the most powerful households in Egypt. Then came Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39. 6 notes almost parenthetically that Joseph was well-built and handsome. That detail is not incidental. In the ancient text, physical description is never accidental. It is a setup. Potiphar's wife, whose name the text never gives us, who exists in this story only as a function of what she does rather than who she is, saw Joseph and she wanted him. Her approach was direct. "Come lie with me." Day after day she asked. Joseph refused. His reasoning, laid out in Genesis 39:9, was precise. He could not do this to Potiphar, who had trusted him with everything. He could not do this before God. She did not stop. The text says she spoke to him every day. One day she grabbed his outer garment as he was entering the house. He left the garment in her hand and ran. She kept the garment. She called her servants first. Note the order. She gathered witnesses before her husband arrived and told them that the Hebrew slave had come to mock her, that she had screamed and he had fled. When Potiphar came home, she told him the same story. Potiphar burned with anger. He had Joseph imprisoned in the place where the king's prisoners were confined, the royal prison that sat within his own jurisdiction as captain of the guard. Here is the detail that several biblical scholars have
No,
noted.
you must stay.
Attempted
Let me
rape
go.
against
Don't run!
the
I
wife
cannot
of
stay.
Potiphar was a capital offense in ancient Egypt. If Potiphar had genuinely believed his wife's accusation, Joseph should have been executed on the spot. The fact that Joseph was imprisoned rather than killed suggests, and scholars like David Guzik and others have argued this, that Potiphar likely suspected his wife's version of events, but was caught in a position where he could not publicly humiliate her without destroying his own reputation. Joseph paid the price of that political calculation with years of his life, and so Joseph descended for the second time. The first descent had been the pit at Dothan, the betrayal by his family, the loss of everything he had by birth. This second descent was the prison, the betrayal of integrity, the loss of everything he had earned. He had done precisely the right thing. He had refused what would have been a profound betrayal of the man who trusted him. He had stood on principle under sustained daily pressure. And the reward for standing on principle was a prison cell in Pharaoh's prison. There is a kind of darkness in that fact that the text does not soften or explain away. It simply records it. Joseph had done what was right. He was in prison for it. And the question that any honest reader of this story has to sit with at this point is the same question Joseph himself must have been sitting with in that cell. When you do everything right and it still goes wrong, what do you do with that? The prison changed nothing about how Joseph operated. This is one of the most psychologically striking elements of his entire story. The pattern that had appeared in Potiphar's house. Joseph being trusted, being elevated, being handed responsibility beyond what his official position would have suggested, appeared again inside the prison. The warden noticed Joseph in the same way Potiphar had noticed him. He put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. He delegated the day-to-day administration of the prison to him. Genesis 39:23 says the warden paid no attention to anything in Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. The man had now risen to a position of influence inside the second worst circumstance of his life, just as he had inside the first. There was something in Joseph that refused to shrink. Sometime into his imprisonment, two of Pharaoh's senior officials were placed in the prison where Joseph was held. One was the chief cupbearer of Pharaoh's household, the official responsible for overseeing Pharaoh's wine, a role of enormous trust in the ancient world because a cupbearer was positioned close enough to the king to potentially poison him. The other was Pharaoh's chief baker, responsible for the royal bread. Both had offended Pharaoh in some undisclosed way and had been confined pending judgment. The captain of the guard, who was Potiphar, the man who had imprisoned Joseph, assigned Joseph to attend to them. One night, both men had disturbing dreams, and in the morning, Joseph noticed that their faces were troubled. He asked why. They told him they had each dreamed but had no one to interpret. Joseph's response is one of the most quietly remarkable lines in this entire story. Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. The cupbearer described his dream first. A vine with 3 branches, blossoms, grapes. He pressed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed it in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interpreted, the 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And then, Joseph made a request, the only request we ever hear him make on his own behalf in the entire narrative. Please remember me when it goes well with you, he said. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this place. For I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. He named both wrongs. He had been stolen from his homeland, and he had been imprisoned unjustly. It was the honest account of a man who had not lost his sense of what was true, even after years of evidence that the truth was not protecting him. The baker, encouraged by the good interpretation given to the cupbearer, shared his dream. 3 cake baskets on his head. In the top basket were baked goods for Pharaoh, and birds were eating them out of the basket. Joseph's interpretation was delivered without hesitation and without softening. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and here Joseph's wording shifts slightly, darkly, from you. He will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from your bones. 3 days later, both interpretations were fulfilled exactly. Pharaoh's birthday, a celebration. The chief cupbearer was restored to his position. The chief baker was executed, and the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. 2 words in the Hebrew that carry the full weight of 2 wasted years. He forgot him. 2 years. 2 years of Joseph waiting for the cupbearer to say something. 2 years of waking up each morning in Pharaoh's prison, wondering if today would be the day, if perhaps the cupbearer had finally mentioned his name to someone. 2 years of silence. We are not given a window into Joseph's inner life during those 2 years. The text moves past them quickly, almost brutally. 2 full years later, Pharaoh had a dream. That is all we are told about the gap. 2 years of Joseph's life, dismissed in half a sentence. But those 2 years were not lost. Something was happening in Joseph during those years that would only become visible when he finally stood before Pharaoh. He was being refined. Whatever remained of youthful arrogance or impatience or the desperate need to be seen and recognized, whatever the pit and Potiphar's household and the prison had not yet finished removing, those 2 years were finishing it. When the door finally opened, the man who walked through it was ready for what waited on the other side. Pharaoh dreamed. The most powerful man on earth stood on the bank of the Nile in his dream, and out of the river came 7 cows, fat, sleek, beautiful, the kind of cattle that any Egyptian farmer would have prayed to see in his herd. They grazed in the reed grass. And then, behind them, came 7 more cows, gaunt, ugly, thin in a way that Pharaoh would later tell Joseph he had never seen in all the land of Egypt, not in all his years as king. And the thin cows ate the fat cows. And they were no fatter afterward. Pharaoh woke up. He fell back asleep and dreamed again. 7 heads of grain on a single stalk, healthy, full, good. Then 7 more heads, thin and scorched by the east wind, and the thin heads swallowed the full ones. Pharaoh woke again, and his spirit was troubled. The Hebrew word used is tifayim, agitated, deeply disturbed in a way that would not settle. Egypt had a rich tradition of dream interpretation. This was not a culture that dismissed dreams as random neural noise. The ancient Egyptians had professional interpreters, dream texts, a vocabulary of symbols with established meanings. The cow was a symbol of Isis, the goddess of the sustaining earth. And in Egyptian hieroglyphics, it represented agriculture and food. The Nile, as the source of Egypt's fertility, you see, appearing as the location where the cows emerged, would have carried enormous symbolic weight. One would expect that any competent Egyptian dream interpreter working within this established framework could have made at least a plausible attempt at the meaning. None of them could. Genesis 41:8. Records that Pharaoh's spirit was troubled, and he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret it for Pharaoh. The silence of Egypt's entire intellectual class is one of the most dramatic moments in the story. Not one man in the most educated court in the known world could explain what Pharaoh had seen. The room would have been very quiet. It was in that quiet that the cupbearer's memory finally moved. He stepped forward and said to Pharaoh, "I remember my faults today." He told the story of the prison, the 2 dreams, the young Hebrew slave who had interpreted them both with perfect accuracy, exactly as he predicted. Pharaoh sent for Joseph immediately. The text tells us that Joseph was hurried out of the dungeon. And then it records 2 actions that most readers pass over quickly, but that are loaded with meaning for anyone who knows the context. Joseph shaved, and Joseph changed his clothes. In Egyptian culture, shaving was not simply a matter of personal hygiene. Egyptian men of standing were clean-shaven. To the Egyptians, the beard was a mark of foreignness, of the uncivilized world beyond the Delta. One scholar noted that in the eyes of all Semitic people, the beard was a mark of dignity. But the Egyptian of better standing was anxious to be delivered to the razor of the barber as soon as he came of age. Joseph, preparing to stand before Pharaoh, shaved off the foreign man and put on clean clothes. He was transitioning. He was preparing to become something new before he entered the room. Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams, and Joseph's first words were, "It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." In 13 years of pit, slavery, and prison, Joseph had not become a man who took credit for what he understood. He interpreted the dreams. 2 dreams, 1 message. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of extraordinary abundance throughout all the land of Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine so severe that the abundance will be forgotten, as if it had never been. The famine will be very grievous. The dream was given twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Then, without being asked, Joseph offered a plan. Let Pharaoh appoint a discerning and wise man and set him over the land. Let officers collect 1/5 of the produce of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them store it in the cities as a reserve for the 7 years of famine. Do this, and the land will not perish. Pharaoh turned to his officials. Can we find anyone like this man? One in whom the Spirit of God is? He turned back to Joseph and said, Since God has shown all this to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his own finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. He put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and men ran before the chariot, calling out, Bow the knee. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since the pit. The boy who had been thrown away and sold for 20 pieces of silver was now the second most powerful man in the ancient world. And his first order of business was to save as many lives as possible before the worst famine in living memory arrived. Joseph moved immediately. He traveled throughout all the land of Egypt. establishing a grain collection and storage system of a scale that the ancient world had never seen organized by a single administrator. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. The text says abundantly, lavishly, beyond measure. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years and stored it in the cities. He stored the grain of the field surrounding each city within that city. He gathered so much grain that he stopped measuring it, because it was like the sand of the sea, beyond measure. Egyptologists and historians who have studied the administrative structures of the late 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom have noted granary systems and canal infrastructure projects from this period that represent a level of centralized agricultural management without precedent in earlier Egyptian history. Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian wife. Her name was Asenath, a name meaning she who belongs to Neith, the Egyptian goddess of wisdom and war. She was the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, which is Heliopolis, the city of the sun, one of the most important religious centers in Egypt. This marriage did two things simultaneously. It integrated Joseph fully into the Egyptian elite class, giving him the social legitimacy and cultural credibility that a foreign slave-turned-administrator would have needed to function at the highest levels of Egyptian society. And it connected him to the priestly class, to the old religious power of Egypt, to the temples where Egypt's relationship with its gods was managed and maintained. Joseph, the Hebrew slave from Canaan, was now an Egyptian nobleman. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph and Asenath had 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh. The name means God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. That name is a window into Joseph's interior world at this moment. He was prosperous. He was powerful. He was safe. He had a wife, children, status, the trust of the most powerful man on earth, and he chose to name his firstborn son after forgetting, after the ability to let go of what had been done to him. He was not celebrating the forgetting. He was marking it as a gift, something he had been given, not something he had achieved on his own. The second son he named Ephraim, meaning, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction, not in spite of the affliction, in the land of it. While it was still the land of it, he had not left his suffering behind. He had become fruitful inside it. Then the 7 years of abundance ended, exactly as Joseph had said they would. The harvests thinned. The Nile flooded weekly. The grain in the fields came up short. And then came the year with no harvest at all. The famine did not stay inside Egypt's borders. Genesis 41. 57 records that the famine was severe over all the earth, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. The text is not making a geographical claim about the literal entire planet. It is describing the scale of the crisis in the cultural language of the ancient Near East. The region we now call the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent from Egypt to Mesopotamia, was in the grip of a multi-year agricultural collapse. In Canaan, several hundred miles to the north, an old man named Jacob looked at his dwindling grain stores and told his sons to go to Egypt. He had heard there was grain there. He said, "Go down and buy for us, that we may live and not die." He sent 10 of his sons. The 11th, the youngest Benjamin, Rachel's second son, the boy Jacob had clung to after Joseph's death, stayed home. Jacob would not risk losing him. The 10 brothers made the journey south. They came to Egypt with everyone else who was fleeing the famine, and they presented themselves before the administrator of the grain distribution, the man who controlled whether their family would eat or starve. They bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. Genesis 42. 6 records this without commentary, but the reader who has been with this story since its beginning knows exactly what is happening. The brothers bowed. Joseph's dream, the dream they had hated him for, the dream that had accelerated their decision to be rid of him, was being fulfilled in that moment. The sheaves were bowing, and Joseph saw them. He recognized them immediately, and they did not recognize him at all. How could they have? He was 17 when they last saw him, a boy in a many-colored tunic, screaming from a pit. He was now in his late 30s, clean-shaven in the Egyptian manner, dressed in fine linen and gold, speaking through a royal interpreter, presiding over the most critical administrative function in the most powerful empire on earth. He had an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. He had an Egyptian wife. He had lived as an Egyptian for 13 years. The 10 men standing before him were Canaanite shepherds, travel-worn from the journey, dusty and anxious. They would not have looked up long enough or closely enough to see the boy they had thrown away. Joseph saw them. Genesis 42:7 says he recognized them, and immediately he made himself strange to them. He spoke harshly. "Where have you come from?" "Canaan," they said, "to buy food." And Joseph accused them of being spies. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land." Why did Joseph not reveal himself immediately? This is one of the most genuinely contested questions in the entire narrative. Scholars and commentators have offered a range of answers across centuries. Was it rage? Was it a deliberate strategy to see whether his brothers had changed? Was it trauma expressing itself as a need to control the situation before becoming vulnerable? Was it the wisdom of a man who understood that a revelation without the right conditions would not produce real reconciliation, only a terrified performance of remorse? The text does not give us Joseph's inner reasoning at this point. It gives us only his actions, and his actions had the quality of a man testing something. He accused them of spying. They protested their innocence, explaining themselves. 12 brothers total. One is no more. The youngest is at home with our father. Joseph insisted. He held them for 3 days. Then he released 9 of them and kept Simeon as a hostage. "Bring your youngest brother back," he said. "That is how I will know you are honest men." While the brothers debated among themselves in the holding cell during those 3 days, they spoke to one another in Hebrew, never imagining the administrator could understand them. And what they said to each other in that moment, 22 years after the fields of Dothan, is one of the most remarkable confessions in all of ancient literature. We are truly guilty concerning our brother. We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. That is why this distress has come upon us. Reuben spoke up then. "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you would not hear." The guilt had never left them. They had carried it for over 2 decades. The thing they had done was still alive inside them, unresolved, unconfessed, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure to force it to the surface. Joseph heard every word. The text says he turned away from them and wept. He gathered himself, washed his face, and returned to give them their orders. He gave Simeon to the prison. He had his servants secretly return each man's silver into his sack of grain, and he sent them home. They discovered the silver on the way back. One of the brothers opened his sack to feed his donkey, and there was the silver, the money they had paid, returned. Their hearts failed them. They turned to one another and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" They arrived home and told Jacob everything. They emptied their sacks, and every man found his silver. Jacob's response was the response of a man who had already lost too much. "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me." He would not let Benjamin go. Reuben offered his own 2 sons as guarantee. Jacob refused. The conversation ended there, and the famine continued, and the grain from Egypt ran out. And Jacob had no choice left. When the grain was gone, Jacob told his sons to go back to Egypt. Judah, not Reuben this time, not the eldest, but the one who had first suggested selling Joseph all those years ago, stepped forward and stated the terms plainly. The man was clear. "We will not see his face unless our brother Benjamin is with us. Send Benjamin, and we will go and buy food for you, and for us, and for our little ones. But if you will not send him, we will not go down." For the man said, "We shall not see his face unless our brother is with us." Jacob's response was the response of a man who had been circling this moment for weeks, hoping to avoid it. "Why did you treat me so badly and tell the man you had another brother?" The sons explained. "The man asked directly about our family. We answered his questions. We could not know he would say, Bring your brother down." And then Judah made a pledge. "I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you may require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever before you." There is a specific word the text uses for what Judah was offering: arev. It means surety, guarantor, the person who stands in the gap between a promise and its consequence. Judah was not simply saying he would try his best. He was saying that if Benjamin was not returned, he himself would bear the full weight of that failure for the rest of his life. The man who had suggested selling Joseph was now putting himself forward as the one responsible for keeping Jacob's remaining son safe. Jacob heard it. He relented. He told his sons to take gifts: balm, honey, spices, pistachio nuts, almonds, and to take double the silver, including the silver that had been returned in their sacks, in case it had been an oversight. And he added a prayer: "May El Shaddai, the Almighty, grant you mercy before the man. If I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." The 11 brothers arrived in Egypt. When Joseph saw Benjamin among them, his full brother, Rachel's second son, the only other person in the world who shared his exact parentage. The text records something that modern readers sometimes find surprising in a man of his stature and power. Joseph was overcome. He had to leave the room. He went into his private chamber and wept. Then he washed his face and came back out in control of himself and ordered the feast to be set. At the feast, something happened that stopped every one of them cold. They were seated at the table in birth order, exact birth order from the eldest to the youngest. 11 men who had traveled hundreds of miles to a foreign country to buy grain from an official they had met only once, and that official had seated them in the precise order of their births. They looked at one another in astonishment. The text uses the word shama. They were astonished. How could he know? And Benjamin's portion was 5 times the portion of anyone else. The test, though they did not know it was a test, had begun. The feast passed. The brothers rose in the morning and headed home with their donkeys loaded with grain. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph sent his steward after them with an accusation. "Why have you repaid evil for good? One of you has stolen my master's silver cup, his divination cup, the one he drinks from." The brothers were horrified. They swore their innocence with such confidence that they offered, "Whoever has it, let him die, and the rest of us will be your slaves." The steward searched the sacks in birth order, oldest to youngest, drawing out the suspense with terrible precision. And in Benjamin's sack, the silver cup was there. They tore their clothes. They loaded their donkeys and went back to the city. They fell before Joseph on the ground. Joseph was stern. "The man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my slave. The rest of you, go in peace to your father." And Judah stepped forward. What Judah said next is described by the biblical scholar Donald Gray Barnhouse as the most moving address in all the Word of God. That is a large claim, and it is not made carelessly. Judah began with profound deference. "O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing, and let not your anger burn against your servant. For you are like Pharaoh himself." He acknowledged the full weight of their powerlessness. He was not arguing. He was not negotiating. He was pleading. And then he began to tell the story. He retold everything. The first visit to Egypt, the administrator's demand for the youngest brother, the return to their father, the old man's grief. He repeated Jacob's words: "You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, 'Surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since.' If you take this one also from me and harm comes to him, you will bring down my gray hair in evil to Sheol." Judah then turned the plea toward its conclusion. "And now, if I go back to your servant, my father and the boy is not with us. Since his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Therefore, please, let your servant remain, instead of the boy, as a servant to my lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. Please, let me remain in the boy's place. Let me be enslaved here and let Benjamin go home. There is a symmetry in that moment that the narrative has been building toward since Genesis 37. Judah, who had proposed selling Joseph into slavery, was now offering himself as a slave in exchange for his brother's freedom. The man who had thought up the transaction that sent Joseph to Egypt was now reversing its terms with his own body. He was not doing it out of calculation. He was doing it because he could not bear to see what it would do to his father. He had watched his father grieve for 22 years for the loss of Joseph. He knew what another loss like that would mean. The grief had finally done what the guilt alone had not been able to do. It had produced in Judah a man capable of sacrificing himself for someone else. And the man standing before him, hearing every word of this speech, was the person whose suffering had made that transformation possible. Joseph could not hold it anymore. Genesis 45:1 says he could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Make everyone go out from me." The Egyptian servants left the room, and Joseph was alone with his brothers, and he wept aloud. The text says, the Egyptians heard it. The house of Pharaoh heard it. Whatever composure he had maintained through every meeting, through every test, through every careful performance of Egyptian authority, it was gone. He wept with the grief and the relief and the overwhelming weight of 22 years compressed into a single moment. And when he had wept, and when the room had gone completely quiet, he turned to his brothers and said 3 words in Hebrew. Ani Yosef. I am Joseph. I am Joseph. 3 words. And then silence. Genesis 45:3 says, his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. The Hebrew word translated as dismayed is nevalu. It carries the full weight of terror, of being so completely destabilized that speech becomes impossible. They had last seen this man as a screaming boy at the bottom of a dry pit. He was now standing before them in the fine linen of the second ruler of Egypt, with the signet ring of Pharaoh on his finger, in the palace, where they had been brought as accused criminals. 22 years of guilt, compressed into the moment they realized who was looking at them. They could not speak. Joseph broke the silence himself. Is my father still alive? Not, where is the money you took? Not, do you understand what you did to me? His first question, the first thing his mind went to after I am Joseph, was his father. He spoke to them quickly, as if he needed them to understand before the terror hardened into something irreversible. Come near to me, he said, and they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. The famine has been in the land 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He said this not once, but 3 times in that conversation, in different forms. God sent me. God sent me before you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. He was not minimizing what they had done. He was not saying it had been fine or that he had not suffered. He was saying that he had constructed a framework around his suffering that was larger than the suffering itself. He threw his arms around Benjamin and wept. Then he kissed each of his brothers and wept. And after that, his brothers talked with him. That phrase, after that, his brothers talked with him, is the first record of actual conversation between Joseph and his brothers that the text gives us. In all the years before the pit, they could not speak a kind word to him. Now, for the first time, they talked with him. Pharaoh heard about it and was moved. He told Joseph to bring his entire family to Egypt, his father, his brothers, their wives and children, and livestock. Pharaoh offered them the best of the land of Egypt. He sent wagons to carry the elderly and the children. He sent provisions for the journey. When Joseph's brothers left to go back and get their father, he called after them, "Do not quarrel on the way." He knew his brothers. He had always known his brothers. Even in this moment of reconciliation, he was still looking after them. The brothers arrived back in Canaan and told Jacob, "Joseph is still alive. He is ruler over all the land of Egypt." And Jacob's heart became numb, for he did not believe them. The Hebrew is vayafeg libo. His heart went faint. It was too much. 22 years of grief, of certainty, of having wept his son into the grave. And now these men were standing before him saying it was not true. But when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, when his eyes rested on the physical, irrefutable evidence that someone of enormous resources had prepared for his arrival, the spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. That is the language of a man coming back from a very long way away. His spirit revived, and Jacob said, "Enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob made one stop before he crossed the border into Egypt. He stopped at Beersheba, the last point of the land of Canaan, the southernmost boundary of the country where his grandfather Abraham had first planted himself and where his father Isaac had lived. He offered sacrifices there, and God spoke to him in the visions of the night. "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," Jacob said. The voice, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again." Jacob had needed to hear that. He was an old man leaving his homeland to go and live in a foreign country under the authority of a son he had mourned as dead. The land of Canaan was the land of promise, the land associated with every covenant God had made with his family. Leaving it was not nothing. The assurance that he was not leaving it alone was the assurance he needed to keep moving. The family descended into Egypt. Jacob, his sons, their wives, their children. 70 people in all, not counting the wives. Joseph received word that his father was coming through Goshen, the fertile region in the eastern Nile Delta that Pharaoh had assigned to the family. He harnessed his chariot and went out to meet Jacob in Goshen. When Joseph saw his father, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. And Jacob said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." It is one of the most human lines in the entire Bible. An old man who has been waiting to die in grief for 22 years, who has refused all comfort, who said he would go to his grave mourning, and now the thing he had grieved is standing in front of him, and he is ready, not in despair, in completion. He had seen Joseph's face. He could go. Joseph prepared his family for their meeting with Pharaoh. He coached them on what to say. They were shepherds. In Egyptian culture, shepherds were viewed with some condescension. The text notes that every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. But Goshen, in the eastern delta, was precisely the kind of land where shepherds could thrive without disrupting the cultural sensibilities of the Egyptian court. Joseph was positioning his family with care. When Jacob stood before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked how old he was, Jacob answered, "The years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. The old shepherd from Canaan, the patriarch who had spent 130 years wrestling with God and with men and with his own failures, stood before the God-king of Egypt and blessed him. Then Jacob went out from Pharaoh's presence. Joseph settled his family in the best of the land of Egypt, in the region of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. He provided for them with food according to the number of their dependents, and he continued administering the famine on behalf of Pharaoh with the same precision and competence that had characterized everything he had ever done. As the famine deepened, the Egyptians spent all their money buying grain. When the money ran out, Joseph took their livestock. When the livestock was gone, he took their land. By the time the famine was over, Pharaoh owned virtually all of Egypt's land and all of its people. The only exceptions were the priests, who had a fixed income from Pharaoh and did not need to sell. Joseph had restructured the entire economy of Egypt, concentrating its wealth in Pharaoh's hands. The ordinary Egyptians, grateful simply to be alive, agreed to it all. "You have saved our lives," they said. "Let us be Pharaoh's servants." The system Joseph built, 1/5 of all produce to go to Pharaoh, would last, the text tells us, until the days of Moses. Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years. He was 147 years old when he knew he was dying. He called Joseph to him and made him swear, "Do not bury me in Egypt. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place of my fathers." Joseph swore. Before Jacob died, he did several things that the text records with great care. He adopted Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, as his own. He elevated Ephraim, the younger, above Manasseh, the elder, in a deliberate crossing of his hands that Joseph tried to correct, and Jacob refused to adjust. "I know, my son, I know. The younger will be greater than the older." The older son elevated past the younger. It was a pattern that had run through Jacob's entire family history, and here he was at the end of his life, deliberately perpetuating it because he believed it was what God intended. Then he blessed each of his sons in turn. Long, complex blessings that read like both prophecy and poetry, that name the character and destiny of each of the 12 tribes that would come from these 12 men. Jacob died, and the first thing that happened after Jacob's death is a revealing window into the brothers' deepest fear. They sent a message to Joseph. Some scholars believe the message was fabricated entirely, that no such instruction from Jacob actually existed, and that the brothers invented it because they needed it, claiming that Jacob had left instructions before his death. "Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you." And then they came themselves, fell down before him, and said, "We are your servants." The last echo of the dream, the final bowing, the sheaves before his sheaf. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He was not weeping at their fear. He was weeping at how far they still had to go to understand that the decision had already been made, that the forgiveness had already happened years before they asked for it. He said to them, "Do not fear. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today." Joseph named what had been done to him precisely. He did not soften it or pretend it had been other than it was. "You intended to harm me." He did not say, "Oh, it was nothing," or "You were young," or "Perhaps you did not mean it so badly." He named it. "You intended harm." And then he named the reframe he had built around that harm over the course of 13 years, in slavery and prison. But God intended it for good. He then promised to provide for them and their little ones. He comforted them and spoke kindly to them. The word the text uses is the same word used for Jacob's attempts to comfort his wives in their grief. Joseph was doing for his brothers what no one had successfully done for his father. He was making them believe that what had happened could coexist with what was coming. Joseph lived to see his children's children. He saw the children of Ephraim to the 3rd generation. He was 110 years old, a number that Egyptologists note was the ideal lifespan in ancient Egyptian literature, the age at which a man was said to have lived a perfect life when he knew he was dying. And his last recorded words were not about his own legacy or his administrative achievements or the famine he had prevented or the millions of lives he had saved. His last words were about what came next. "I am about to die," he said, "but God will surely visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And then he made them swear, "When God visits you, carry up my bones from here." His last act was an act of faith in a future he would not live to see. He died. They embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. What does this story actually say about the human condition? That is the question worth sitting with now that the narrative has run its full length. Joseph was not the only person in this story who suffered. Jacob suffered the grief of a father who believed his son was dead. Leah suffered the daily reality of being the wife who was not loved. Judah lived for decades under the weight of something he had done and could not undo. Even Reuben, the eldest brother, who had tried to stop the worst of what happened and failed, carried his own particular flavor of guilt. This story is populated by people who have been damaged by the structural dysfunction of the household they were born into and who damage others in turn. That is a human pattern. It is a pattern that the text does not excuse or romanticize. What is unusual about Joseph is not that he suffered. It is what he did with the suffering. He did not use it to justify becoming cruel. He did not let it produce in him the kind of man who, the moment he had power, reached immediately for the opportunity to make the people who had hurt him feel what he had felt. He had every resource to do that. He had access to Pharaoh's prison. He had the authority to send his brothers back to Canaan in chains. He had years in which he could have quietly arranged their ruin. He chose not to. And his explanation for why not is the most theologically dense statement in the entire Joseph narrative. You intended harm, but God intended it for good. That reframe is not the same as saying the harm did not happen. It is not denial or repression or pretending. It is the result of a man who spent 13 years in the worst circumstances imaginable, asking the hardest question available to him, what is this for? And finding an answer that was larger than his pain. Whether you read this story as pure history, as sacred text, as archaeology, as literature, or as all of these at once, the central human question it raises is the same. It is the question of what a person does when the thing that is happening to them has no good explanation in the moment. Not every Joseph ends up on a throne. Not every 13 years of suffering resolves into a reunion. Not every person who does the right thing under pressure is vindicated in their lifetime. The story does not promise any of that. What it demonstrates, in the life of this specific man, in this specific ancient world, is the possibility of remaining whole inside the breaking, of keeping your character when the circumstances are doing everything they can to take it from you. Joseph did not survive Egypt because he was invulnerable. He survived Egypt because he was not consumed by what Egypt did to him. That distinction is the difference between a man who made history and a man who was simply buried in it. Before we close, here is the question we want to leave you with. Think about the moment in this story that hit you the hardest. Was it the pit? Was it the prison? Was it the moment Potiphar's wife held up a garment as evidence and Joseph had no defense? Was it the 2 years of silence after the cupbearer went home and forgot him? Or was it those 3 words in that empty room, I am Joseph, and the way the brothers could not answer him? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. This channel runs on those conversations. And while you are in the comments, let us know again where in the world you are watching from, because the reach of these stories never stops surprising us. If you made it to the end of this video, we want to say something directly to you. A story of this length, this depth, with this much historical ground to cover, it asks something of a viewer. It asks patience and attention and the willingness to sit inside complexity rather than rush to the easy answer. The fact that you are still here means something. It means this story found something in you worth speaking to. And that is exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. If you found value in this video, the most meaningful thing you can do is share it. Not because this channel needs the numbers, but because there are people in your life who are sitting in their own version of the pit right now. And this story was made for them. A brother, a parent, a friend who has been doing everything right and watching it go wrong. Send it to them. And if you are new to Fireside Bible Study, here is what we do. We take the stories of the ancient world, the history, the archaeology, the human psychology, the textual scholarship, and we put them back together the way they were meant to be experienced, as stories. Not as doctrines, not as Sunday school summaries, not as footnotes in a theological argument, but as full human narratives with stakes and tension and people you care about. We go deep, we go long, and we go everywhere the evidence takes us. Subscribe now so you do not miss what is coming, because if you thought the story of Joseph was extraordinary, and it is, wait until you hear about the woman who saved an entire nation by walking into a banquet she had not been invited to, knowing that if she said the wrong thing to the wrong man, she would not walk back out. That story is coming to this channel. Do not miss it. Subscribe now, leave your comment below, and we will see you in the next one.